Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. Spent a long time making wood hinge boxes. Used to dovetail the corners. Found out the public really didn't appreciate it. Made a finger joint jig that would make them like that. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help you take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, be sure to subscribe. Turn on that notification bell, and don't forget to turn on the notification on your mobile device so you'll know every time we release a new video. Good? All right, back to the bench. Back in 1986, I took a class from a man named Dale Nish, who's a professor at Brigham Young University, and he introduced me to this concept of the wood hinge box, or the wood hinge, and I just was enamored with it from the very beginning. So I have, over the last 40 years, made a lot of boxes. I haven't made 2,000, but very close. And I used to take the time, as I mentioned, to go through and actually dovetail them. Well, the amount of time it would take to hand dovetail a box like that could easily involve 4 to 6 hours. And in the process of selling them, I found out that the population, for the most part, really couldn't tell the difference. So if you presented this one, which is done on a machine, this one, which is done by hand, they didn't care enough to be willing to spend the money that I'd need to charge in order to justify making this one. Now, what a typical finger joint produces both pieces, meaning the white piece and the dark piece, the same size. And that, to me, always looked more like some kind of a box that you would pack fruits or vegetables in. So I started messing around with a jig that I had this idea that would allow me to alter the spacing. So I could get a wide tail, which would mimic the dovetail, and a narrow pin, which would mimic the actual pin in a dovetail joint. It took several prototypes before I finally got it to where it was accurate and consistent, and I could easily adjust. But I got there. We've been using this one, the last one I made, for the last, oh my goodness, probably been 12 to 15 years, and it still works. It's been modified a few times, but I'm going to walk you through it, and I'll give you the dimensions, and hopefully you'll be able to produce one yourself. But when you get it up and running, that box that, as I mentioned, could easily take 4 to 6 hours to build, this one could be done in an hour because that finger joint was so easy and so quick. And in using cyanacrylate as the means of gluing it meant that you could assemble it, get it square, perfect, put the glue on after the fact, and it worked just as well. And if you've ever built a dovetailed box, you know how much work is involved just in the glue up process. So I'll clear this off, and I'm going to show you and I'll actually demonstrate how my finger joint box works and how we adjust it, and I'll give you all the dimensions and everything you need so you can do it. Now, this isn't going to win any beauty awards, but it was never intended to. I'm actually going to go through and run it first so you can see how it works. Then we'll go back and we'll kind of look at it a lot more closely. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is hook up my vacuum hose. I just find that it's a lot easier if you're not having to clear sawdust off after every cut. There's 2 routers, and not that it matters, but I think they're both 3 horsepower. So I'm going to do this side first. So this is the one that's going to cut the spacing. I'll show you on this one. This is going to cut the spacing on the ends. So that means this height needs to be the thickness of this piece, which is going to be represented by this piece of maple. So I set that right there. Now I've got the router I happen to use makes it a lot easier than normal to adjust. So I'll get that, and I have it so the cutter's sticking just up above. And I'll lock that in place. Now, I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to hold it tight against this pin. This pin moves along with this slider. Now we'll go to the opposite end, and since this is going to be cutting the piece in the white, then the height of the cutter needs to be matched to the thickness of this end piece, which happens to be the one in my hand. So we need to bring that up just a bit. Now, one of the limiting factors here is if you get that up too tall, it has a tendency to vibrate. So you're a little bit stuck with having to be limited by that factor. Now, I need to have the spacing between this pin and the cutter by the thickness of one of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in place, and I'm going to set it right about there. Actually, let's start that over. Okay, so on this end, this cutter is going to be making the cut in the light piece, the piece of maple. So we have to have that cutter raised up to represent the thickness of this piece, or the end piece, which is this one. So if I put that in there, I want the cutter just sticking above it. Now the limiting factor here is this narrow cutter. The taller it is, the more it's going to vibrate. So I find you go much beyond a ½ inch, and it just does not give you a very nice cut. So I'm topped out right here at half. Now I need to start by removing that thickness off the corner of this piece. So what I need to be able to do is to move that over and have it locked in a position. So what I'll do is I'll take this piece, and I've got my cutter positioned so that the cutter is facing the side my finger's touching. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to move it over so it just touches the side of this piece. I'm going to lock this in place. Now, it might be just a little bit too close. Turn the vacuum on. Now, if you try to make one cut, one pass, one cut, you usually end up with a piece of material that breaks free there, and it just causes a bit of havoc. So I'm going to start by taking a partial cut first. Now I'll go all the way over. Now if I was building a box, with this setup, I would cut this end and both ends of the opposite piece. But since we're just demonstrating this one cut, I can remove that now. And my first cut is going to be made with this piece moved all the way over to that tooth. Hold it securely. All right, let's go over to the bench and see how these fit. Okay, I just want to get rid of this fuzz. This is the one. Now we want these to be tight enough that they won't need to be clamped, and also tight enough that the thin cyanacrylate glue, the super glue I use, will work by capillary action. So it's got to be snug. So wiggle that in. Make sure it's sitting tight. And there's a nice, see if I can close that with the rubber mallet. Okay, nice snug fit. And we put just a little bit of glue on there, and it'll wick all the way around, and you've got a good secure joint. And it takes mere seconds to do. All right, now let's go back over, and I'll take this apart, or at least I'll take I'll disassemble as much as I can and show you exactly how we did it and how it's adjusted. This is made mostly out of MDF, although there's some plywood as well. We'll start off with the dimensions, and I don't think there's anything sacred about this. It just happened to be what worked. So my top is 24 inches long by 14 inches wide. The height really doesn't matter. You're going to adjust that. And when we threw on these pieces just so that we didn't have it sitting on a table any longer. This top section that moves, the sliding table, is 15 3/8 by 11 11/16. And I needed height here in order to be able to support and easily clamp the pieces when we needed to. So that's 3 inches tall. So I wanted this to be compact. I didn't want two separate pieces. That's why it's all together. The MDF wears well. You want to try to eliminate as much slop as possible in this sliding piece. So you have to be really careful when you're making it that is how you allow for that. As far as what's driving it, this is a Freud 3 horsepower. What I like about it is it's a quick and easy adjust for your height. You simply unlock it, and then you can turn this one way or the other, and that raises and lowers the bit. And your power switch is over here. It has this handy vacuum attachment that you can stick your vacuum on, and it does, at least helps in keeping the chips clear. Not the easiest thing to change the bit, but the bit will last a long time, and I use these only in here, so they're not being used anywhere else. Now I put a bulkhead in here to strengthen the whole thing and also to prevent this MDF top from sagging over time. And we have the exact same router on the other side, so it could easily run off a 1 horsepower router. I just happen to have these, so I used them. And as I mentioned, I like the fact that the adjustment is on there. So if we take the top off, we have one slot running down through the middle. And if you can grasp this concept, I'm going to put this back on for just a second. What's critical is you decide which size cutters you're going to use. So I went with a 3/16 and a 1/2 inch. Now you could go 1/8, but 1/8 of an inch, you're not going to be able to cut very tall, or you're not going to have that be able to raised up too high because it'll just vibrate too much. So in terms of trying to get a small pin and a large pin, I thought 3/16 worked well and 1/2 inch. Over here, the distance from the outside of the cutting circle on this 1/2 inch bit and your guide pin over here has to be the exact same as the width of this 3/16 cutter. And on this side, the distance between your cutter and that guide pin has to be the same as the width of this 1/2 inch cutter over here. So we had to allow for something that would allow us to make a micro adjustment. So when I mounted, and I went in and I actually altered the router base. I drilled holes in it. It's made out of aluminum, so it was easy to do. I drilled holes in it so that I could allow it to shift a little bit. So I have 3 bolts holding it in place. This one is in a 0 clearance hole, so everything pivots from this point. And over here, I've got this sunk flush, both of them down below the surface. I saturated this area and the MDF with cyanacrylate to make it stiff so that these washers wouldn't cut into that soft inner core. But by loosening these, I can pivot this from here just enough to make a very minor adjustment in trying to get that the exact distance from this pin as the width of my cutter on the opposite end. And I did the same thing over here. Real simple. In terms of this slider, it's just a box. I actually usually keep some weight in here just because I find it's a lot smoother to operate if there's a little bit of weight there and it doesn't get it's not affected by the vibration of the machine quite as much. And you want to make sure that this is good and square to the table so that when you're cutting your pieces, if everything is square and right on, when you put that joint together, and then you go in and check it to see if it's square, you're guaranteed that the joint's going to be fitting tight at the base here and also down there. The height change, that's easy, as I mentioned. You just raise and lower your bit based on the thickness of the opposing piece. We What else can I show you on this? I really think that's just about all there is to it. In terms of keep making sure you don't have any slop here, I made this cut down through the MDF, and then I simply took a piece, actually that's a piece of Baduke, and of course I made that cut, and I made the cut in this sliding piece with the same setup, and then you just carefully fit this piece until it fits in there with absolute minimal slop. And of course, a little bit of wax goes a long way in helping it. Now, that guide that we use for the overall movement of this jig is the same pin that we use to reference this piece and keep it 3/16 of an inch away from that cutter. However, on this side, I had to put in a separate pin. And that's a little bit tricky because you're having to do this after the fact. But if you're careful with your measurements, you can get that exactly where you need it to be, so that when you put it in place, everything works the way it's supposed to. And there's a dust collector on this side as well. And the biggest problem is making sure that there is absolutely no debris underneath your piece as you step it over. Now, when I was doing this, I don't know if you could hear me with the machine running, but you always have to make sure that you're tight against that pin. You can't allow for any slop, you can't allow for any debris in there, or it's going to impact how the joint fits when you're done. So that's got to be kept tight. Now, no matter what you do, you're going to have a little bit of movement in this piece. So I always make sure that when I'm doing this, I push it tight to that side, and the same thing over here, I push it tight to this side, so that I'm doing the absolute best I can to eliminate any movement. So in closing, I'll just show you how the glue works. If you've never used this before, it's referred to as cyanacrylate or super glue for wood. So I would go in. The downside to it is when it soaks into the end grain, it'll often leave a stain. So I would go along there and just ever so slightly run a little bit of glue on either side, and it'll find its way down through, and it'll wick. You can see it wick all the way down around. Try to keep it from running all over the box. But give that a couple minutes to set up, and it makes for a very strong joint. And I've never had one fail over all these years using that system. So if you want to make good boxes, fun boxes, and you want to make them rather quickly, check out that jig. Make one for yourself, and you're well on your way. Hope you enjoyed it. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.